Welcome to Navigating India. My guest today is Daisy Rockwell, an author, translator, painter, and winner of the International Booker Prize. Daisy translates from Hindi and Urdu into English and has brought some of the most important voices of South Asian literature to readers across the world. In this conversation, we talk about how she come to learn Hindi and Urdu, what draws her to a text and make her wants to translate it, and what it means to carry a work across languages without losing its soul. We also talk about her first visit to India, the relationship between a translator and their authors, and about the ongoing debate between translation and AI and what it means to the future of the craft of translation. Daisy Rockwell is one of the most thoughtful voices working in literary translation today, and this is a conversation I have been looking forward to for a very long time. Daisy Rockwell, thank you so much for coming on this show. And I want to start with this question. You grew up in Western Massachusetts in a family of artists, your grandfather being Norman Rockwell, one of the America's most iconic painters. Yet you were attracted to Hindi and Urdu literatures, worlds that couldn't seem more distant. So, how did these two worlds come together, the very American world you were born into and the literary traditions of South Asia?
Well, I don't know. I always, growing up, I liked studying languages. When I went to college, I was actually a classics major, studying Greek and Latin. And um, I had studied a lot of different Western languages, and I decided I wanted to try something that I didn't know anything about at all. So like start from scratch. So I didn't really know anything. Um, I didn't, at that time I didn't eat Indian food or anything. Um, so I guess that's how I got into it, and it has nothing to do with being from a family of artists, but except for that my family, you know, would not put any restrictions on what I would do with my education or my career because they're all artists, and my grandfather and my father both didn't even complete high school. So um like my father just thought it was very exciting that I was going to college, and because they went to art school instead, you know. um but I also have to say that my grandfather did visit India when he was older, and he painted a portrait of Nehru. And there's photographs of him putting on his shoes outside the Jama Masjid in Delhi, and there's a photograph of him in a Sindhi fishing boat in Karachi. So like it's not as um, unrelated as people think. He even wrote in the back of the round of the Nehru portrait, he wrote Shanti in Devanagari script. So,
I mean, there's certainly some connection. It doesn't come out of a whim to study Hindu and Urdu for you. So there's some
yeah,
distinct connection with it.
right.
So when you entered the university, you actually started studying Hindi in the university, and I think you have taken up a translation course with A.K. Ramanujan. So could we have some reflections on that?
Yeah, so that was I ended up switching my majors. I don't know, like, if your listeners are mostly in India, then they would not know that in the US, you people can just sort of whimsically switch their program of study in the middle, and it's like not considered a big deal or nobody cares, right? So I switched my major three times in college. So I started out as doing classics, Greek and Latin, and then I went to linguistics, and then I switched to South Asian studies. And so that was what my degree was in. And then I went immediately into the graduate program in that department at the University of Chicago in the South Asian Studies Department. And so my course with A.K. Ramanujan was in my first semester of graduate school. And it was just amazing, an amazing class because It was not South Asia focused. People were doing translating from all different languages, so like Japanese and Romanian, Persian, Spanish, like just all different stuff. And we would just workshop our translations together, and he was like just very full of kind of pearls of wisdom. And it was I thought, wow, the graduate school is going to be so great because it's just going to be like this all the time. And then he unexpectedly passed away about 2 weeks after the class ended. So it was horrible. I mean, I'm laughing now because it's ridiculous, but it was horrible for me personally, selfishly, because um, from then on, I didn't have that kind of mentorship or help and or even support at all. Like I said, in academia, translation is considered kind of like a hobby or something like that. So I wasn't encouraged to translate really very much after that, and it became, for a long time just a side thing that I did.
No, that is very unfortunate. Do you have any personal encounters with A.K. Ramanujan that you can recall?
Well, one story I like to tell because people always ask me, like, what do you think about footnotes? Putting footnotes in your translations. And so then I always give them a quote from him because when he would say something, he was like deeply felt, so the way he spoke was just like this is coming from deep down inside. So he would say, every footnote is a confession of failure. And so that's, like I will never forget that. And I have never dropped a footnote in my translations ever. I mean, it's the author themselves footnotes, then I translate the footnote, but I don't drop a footnote. So, because he just like, even if I was tempted, there's 10 times when I've been tempted, but I can't get that sentence out of my head.
Every footnote is confession of a failure. Wow, I think that's indeed a very powerful sentence about translations, Daisy. I want to move on to your early translations. You have translated many works of Upendranath Ashk. And so, how did you first encounter Upendranath Ashk's work? And what about his works that has deeply drawn you towards translating his works?
Well, when I was in graduate school, I knew I wanted to study Hindi literature, but I wasn't sure, like, I knew some of the famous books, but and I read some things, but I wasn't sure, like, what there was out there. So I read an essay written actually by a German scholar of Hindi about Ashk and how he was like the Hindi Proust. And I thought that was kind of cool. And I was just very interested. And I mean, the author, this scholar, just was very into him. So I thought I would try reading Geetanjali, which is his big, like his first novel. Well, not his first novel, but the first novel in a series of sort of seven. Like some of the last ones were posthumous. Um, but I just got very into it because he everything is described in the most minute detail. So like he's walking down the street and he sees the guy who makes the soda water. Like it's actually kind of a complicated and it's slightly dangerous procedure. And to get soda, the water like stuck into the bottle, and then with they put a glass ball in it to seal it. Anyway, the reason why I know all this is because he describes it in extreme detail. And so it's like um, it's sort of like this admiration for things like a guy making a key, like that gives it these kind of every day at that time. Now you never see somebody making a key, obviously, but at these everyday artisanal activities he saw, he kind of experienced as art. And I loved that. I thought that was so fascinating. Like even though he was this main character, Chetan, is a lower middle class Punjabi guy who's an aspiring writer, but he's kind of a pathetic character, and he's poor, and he's like has writer's block all the time and stuff like that. But he just walks around like the second novel in the series, which I translated, Sheher Mein Gumta Aina, the mirror wandering in the city, but that's not, my editor switched the words around. But anyway, I can't remember the English title. So he like it's just a whole day of him walking around in the city of Jalandhar, which people will laugh. Like people say, like, how can you say he's the Indian priest? Like he's Punjabi, like people are so snotty about Punjabis, and so, and like how can like Jalandhar is not Paris, and that kind of thing. But he like treats it like Paris, in the sense that like every detail fascinates him and resonates with him and depresses him and makes him happy, like that, just like deep reaction to every single thing he sees.
No, that is very interesting. But you also have visited India, and that visit to India is very much connected with a program of Susan and Lloyd Rudolph's. So, so two broad things, which is could you reflect about your first visit to India, and I'm sure that has driven you to translate Indian works.
Mhm.
And second thing, also your encounter with Susan and Lloyd Rudolph, because these two are also Americans and who had like very significant impact on Indian political academia. So,
Oh yes, yes. Well, I could talk to you all day about Suzanne and Lloyd Rudolph, but I'll keep it as short as I can. So my first encounter was um, in my second year of college. I went into a class that was required, a social sciences kind of basic class that everybody who was in their second year and their sophomore year had to take. And this was a unit on political economy. And the professor was Suzanne Rudolph. And she started out by just explaining what her life was like. That she said she and her husband Lloyd studied the political economy of South Asia, and they spent every fourth year in India doing research. And they'd written, various books, and their children had grown up part of the time in India and so on. And this was actually what prompted me to sign up for the Hindi class because um, her life sounded like super fun, honestly. And and I was like taking Latin for, I don't know, the umpteenth year. And I was that evening I sat down to do my Ovid homework, translating Ovid. And I just thought, I don't want to do this anymore. Like, where will I end up? Like the scholarship, from the perspective of scholarship, the classical world is so picked clean, like, and you end up specializing on something teeny tiny. And like, you're just kind of focus into something very small. So I just sort of started looking in the course catalog, and I saw that Hindi fit into my schedule. And so I signed up for it. Postscript on that social sciences class, it was like not something that I really understood at all. It was, we were studying Marx and Weber, and like I didn't really even know what political economy was, and I was pretty much lost the whole time, even though she's a great professor and everything. But I just still admired her deeply. So then I'll like do another chapter of the Rudolphs. So then I'd been studying Hindi for a year. So I think it was at the end of that year, suddenly it was announced there was going to be a study abroad program in India with like a Hindi language component. And so the students would go to India and then they would go to Missouri, where there's a Hindi language school, Landauer language school. And they would have an intensive, like 4 hours a day course for 3 months. So it would be like the equivalent of a year of in the university. And then they would travel. So I jumped at the chance, and it turned out it was organized by Suzanne. Um, and only one other person signed up who was in my Hindi class. And he we were like probably the only two people that weren't South Asian in the class. And so we were often pretty lost. And he was more lost than I was, I'll have to say. And he'd never even traveled at all in his life. And so but then the whole thing, like anybody, a university would get sued now if they sent students on a study abroad program like what we were sent on, because we we landed in Delhi and a driver from the American Institute for Indian Studies picked us up, and he took us to this hotel that we were supposed to have reserved. Like we wrote them a letter because this is like before the internet. So, we wrote them a letter saying, please reserve us some rooms. And they didn't do it. Like there weren't any rooms for us. And so the driver didn't know what to do with us because it was like 3 o'clock in the morning. And so he took us to the American Institute for Indian Studies and told us to sleep on the sofas in the meeting room. So we went to sleep on these sofas, and in the morning, the director, who was this very scary man named Pradeep Jagannath, and he came in, and he was furious. And he said, we have to get them out of here right now. Because we looked pretty dirty, because we'd been traveling for like 36 hours or something. And so we were sent off to a B&B. Um, but we didn't know where it was. Like we did we didn't know the address or anything. And and so we were scared to leave, but then we started getting hungry. Like they gave us breakfast, but eventually we needed to eat more food. And so we had like a map. And so we just went out. We left the B&B, which is just in someone's house, right? And we like started walking until we got to a bigger street. And so we could see the street signs. So then we would look on the map and try to figure out where we were. And then we kept walking, and then we found a taxi stand. Or what we thought was a taxi stand because we'd never seen like an Indian taxi, and they were all ambassadors at the time. And so I think we took a taxi to the American Express office in Connaught Circle because we needed to change our money. Because in those days you had to go and like stand in these long lines and do all this paperwork to change money. You couldn't just go to an ATM or something. So that's how we figured out what neighborhood we were in, and then she gave us Suzanne's instructions where to get to Missouri. You go to the taxi stand at Kashmiri Gate in Old Delhi, and you tell them you want to take a taxi to Landauer Bazaar, which is like 8 hours or something. Um, and then, arrange for them to pick you up. And so we did that, but we were very skeptical because, like, you know, it was like, what taxi stand? It's just the taxi stand near Kashmiri Gate. She didn't give us a business name or anything like that. So then we took this taxi, and we were like, it was fine for a while, but then it was still kind of monsoon, so it started to rain a bit, and we were going up the switchbacks to Missouri, and the driver wouldn't use his windshield wipers for some reason. And he had like this gumcha that he would reach around and like wipe the windshield, and it was like dark and raining on the switchbacks up to Lindor. So we were honestly totally terrified, like we thought we were gonna die. And then he finally got up to Lindor Bazaar, which is like those roads are very narrow by the time you get up there because it's above the city of Missouri. And we got up to the top, and then he couldn't, it's just like now I know that this happens anytime you go somewhere in India. Like nobody knows where the house is, right? And so you have to like start asking lots and lots of people. But at the time, it seemed very terrifying that he didn't have any idea where we were going. And after a while, he like stopped the car in this totally dark area and got out and laughed. See, our Hindi was terrible, right? We'd only had a year of it. We had no idea like what he was saying to us. And so he said something to us and then he went away and left us in the car. And he probably just said, "Oh, there's a house over here, and I'm gonna go and knock on the door or something like that." But we just thought he's leaving us here. And then suddenly, the headmaster of the language school knocked on the window and said hi. It was all after that. It was all fine, but it was like a very, very weird. Like you'd never do that now to a bunch of students. Just tell them like, go to India and go to Kashmiri Gate, get a taxi, and then go into the Himalaya and see what happens. And
When,
all
when,
our like travel afterwards, we did it all ourselves. We bought our own tickets and like nobody helped us do anything.
when was this, Dicey? What is the timeline of this encounter?
Okay, yeah, good question. I think that was okay. I saw the fall of the Berlin Wall on the TV in Landauer Bazaar. So I think that's 89.
That is very interesting. But I think sorry for the not very good hospitality at the first encounter in India.
Well, it was her fault, Suzanne's fault, not India's fault. Oh, and of course, the American Institute of Indian Studies, but that guy is terrible. Like I've had run-ins with him since. So anyway, I'm still not done with my Suzanne and Lloyd Rudolph stories because we haven't even gotten to Lloyd. Do you want me to tell you more?
Yes, yes, please
Okay.
go ahead. Please go ahead.
Okay. So that I still hadn't met Lloyd. Um, and then so I went to India and came back, and then as I said, I started graduate school right away, and I needed like a job, a campus job. Um, and somehow like Suzanne, I went to see Suzanne or something, and she said, "Well, we need an assistant." Oh, and I said, "Yay!" And so they had these two offices, like a his and hers office, but then like a little entry room. And I sat at a desk in the entry room, so I was basically their gatekeeper, like people called me that. Um, and I like went through their mail and I did photocopying. They typed things up, but obviously if you're sitting right there, you get to know people really well. Like I got to know them really well, and I was just always astounded at for one thing, how well they get along. They got along so well that they could write books together. They did all their research together. They had adjoining offices, and they were just always like wonderful to each other and respectful. And they were respectful to us. And like, once Lloyd said, "Oh, I could use a cup of coffee," and I said, "Do you want me to make you one?" And he said, "No, no, that would be exploitation." So he like very conscious of things like that. And we had a huge file system, and then email was invented at this time, and they really didn't see why they should have to sit down and log into an email account. Like that was seemed like a bridge too far. So one of my jobs was I had to print out all their emails and like stick it in with the mail, and then they would say, please reply. They would write in pen, please reply to so and so that I want to do this. Like it took them a few years to finally realize that they were going to have to actually log in and use this stuff. While they just treated it like a telegram or something. So, and then later, I we saw them in India a few times. My husband and I were there when I was doing research, and they went at one point they made us go on a pilgrimage to Gangotri with them. And they were like, you know, 60 years, they're probably in their late 60s. They were so much more fit than we were. Charged ahead of us, and like had altitude sickness and crawled along, behind them. But yeah, they were the most wonderful people, just absolutely like role models in every way.
That is very interesting. Would you reflect about Indian food in your visit that we haven't spoken about?
Oh, Indian food. Well, I love Indian food and I cook Indian food, and Indian food is the greatest. And I did mention that when I started India, I didn't know anything about Indian food, but I soon figured it out. And I don't know if you've ever been to Chicago, but there's a whole street, Devon Avenue, which is all Indian and Pakistani restaurants. Um, and in those days, there was also like lots of video stores, and there was even a little bookstore that had Hindi books and things like that. So I was there all the time, um, renting movies and eating food and going. They had groceries, big grocery stores, Indian grocery stores. So in fact, I made Indian food last night. I cook Indian food all the time.
So what did you make last night?
Okay, so you can't get good paneer around. I live in the middle of nowhere. Like I live in the Gao in Vermont. So you can't get good paneer. So I learned how to make paneer, which isn't hard. But people are always like, "What? You made your own paneer? That's crazy." Anyway, I discovered that the best paneer comes from like like raw milk. And there's a lot of organic dairy farms around here because it's Vermont. Vermont is like that. So I go and I get like organic, full fat milk, and then I make the paneer. And then I usually when I make sag paneer, the other thing that Vermont is famous for is kale. Like it's like very tough leafy green. So I usually make it with kale rather than regular like pollock or something like that. So it's a bit Vermonty, my pollock paneer, um but it's still pollock paneer. And then sometimes I make stovetop naan, like on the tawa. I made naan last night and it was very good. And then I made a sabzi with sweet potatoes. So that's like shakar kandi, but here they're like much darker orange, and bangan. And then we had rice and raita with cucumber raita.
No, we need a cookbook from you soon about
Yes.
how you're blending the Vermont and the Indian styles.
Yeah.
Daisy, one more thing I want to talk about is your paintings, right? You're also a painter, and there is something about the pen name you paint under, right?
Uh,
So tell us the story of it. How did you arrive at that, and the pen name that you have chosen for your
so
painting?
how did I become Lapata?
Yes, how did you become the Lapata?
So Lapata, as you know, means like missing, or like you can't something you can't find, or it doesn't have an address, whereabouts unknown. Um, and so I left in 2006. I left academia, kind of in a huff, and and I was doing freelance. I was painting, and I was doing like freelance grant writing. Um, and a friend of mine who ran a blog, because blogs were big then, called Chapati Mystery. He's from Pakistan and he's a historian based in the US. he asked me to write for the blog, and he said you can write anything you want, and you can put up your paintings, and like you can do whatever you want. And I said, but I don't want anyone to know who I am because I was just like kind of in hiding. And so he said, well, just make up, a pen name like a Takhalus, and then nobody will know. And so in those days, like whenever I encountered an academic person that like a former colleague or whatever, they would say, "What happened to you, Daisy? Where did you go? You've disappeared." And so I chose Lapata because I had disappeared from my career, basically. Um, so I started to blog first under that name, and then I started to sign my paintings with it in Urdu, and I still do. And there's sort of residual elements of this Lapata name in various, like my Facebook name is actually Lapata and not my real name because I was living in Palo Alto at the time, and that was right when Facebook was created. So I actually saw those Facebook people, milling around downtown, and I didn't trust them one bit, and I was right. So I didn't never gave them my real name.
That's a very interesting story. I mean, we have this film called Labata Ladies. I'm sure you have seen that
Yeah,
film.
yeah, I haven't seen it yet. Yeah, I should see it, I know. People are always sending it to me. I mean, like the posters and stuff.
So that's an interesting reference. So turning on to your works of translation, you have translated both the writings of 1930s and 40s, and you're also translating the contemporary writers. And I want to pick up two works of yours, which is the Chinese Tamas and then Khadija Mastoor's The Women's Courtyard, where your writings
Hmm.
about the partition, right? And there were very important accounts when we don't have an academic accounts about what's happening with partition, especially the women voices. I think the Women's Courtyard gives a glimpse of it. So could you
Hmm.
give a reflection about how did you come to the partition literature, and so how do they become important to understand the partition in the post-colonial terms?
Well, I'll have to tell you that the very first novel I read in Hindi is called Jhuta Sach by an author named Yashpal. And this I was my Hindi professor in graduate school. He was a linguist. He wasn't a literature scholar, and he knew things about just every single language in the world. His name was Colin Pimasika, and so he was not at all literary, but he was somehow ended up being a Hindi professor, like kind of by accident, because in his era that sort of thing happened. It doesn't happen anymore, but anyway, it happened to him. He was doing field work in Hyderabad, and his advisor in Chicago wrote him a letter and said, "Can you come back to Chicago because we need a Hindi professor?" So he did. Anyway, he was fast. He was always experimenting on us, like in terms of pedagogy. So he was kind of bored, so he would just always come up with these things like, and so this for this class, he said, "Well, you American graduate students, you never learn how to read like for pleasure, to read rapidly in Hindi because everybody's always translating things word for word, like it was kind of an illogical approach that people were using, so as though Hindi were Sanskrit." So he said, what we should do is you need to learn how to do rapid reading. And so that means you have to read a really long book. So he chose this book, Jota Sach, which is like 1,000 pages
Yeah.
in two parts. He he didn't really know how we would learn how to read rapidly, but he didn't want us to like keep looking words up all the time. So I thought this was a great idea. And so I personally took it to heart and I developed a technique for myself to learn to read rapidly. So what I would do is like I would read a chapter, and whenever there was a word that persistently got in my way, like made it so that I really wasn't sure what was going on, I would just note it in my notebook. And then I would afterwards, there would be a lot of these words. I would make a flashcard of it, and then I would memorize all the words that I didn't know, like that were in my way. Not every word I didn't know, but the words were in my way. And then I'd go back and reread the chapter. And so that way I built up like a really good working vocabulary for reading. But I also became obsessed with this novel. Because it's a great partition novel, and it starts out in Lahore, then ends up in Delhi, and there's just like millions of characters, as you might imagine, because it's 1,000 pages long, and the prose is not that difficult to read. Like if for any listeners out there that are scared to read in Hindi because they stopped reading in class 10, which is what I hear constantly. Yashpal is not hard to read. Like he's not doing anything funky with language. He's just like it's just like straight up. So it's addictive, and like there's a great plot and like lots of shocking plot twists and stuff like that. But it's also very serious. Like he will actually put in whole speeches that, like that were actually given, like so, and like things from the real newspaper articles. So it's carefully researched too, like very accurate and not sensationalist. So I didn't really know anything about the partition before I read this 1,000-page novel, and it's like it's better than any history. I'm telling you, this book is like the greatest. Um, and I won't go into my sad story of why I never translated it, or why I translated half of it but didn't finish it. But but anyway, that was how I started getting interested in partition and partition literature. And I did write my master's thesis about that novel. And I continued just to always seek out partition literature, and think about, like academically, is this an actual genre? Like, or is this just like literature that happens to be about this time? Like, can we think of it as a genre and that kind of thing? Um, and it's a fascinating time for a writer to write about, because there's this huge break in everybody's narratives. Like everybody's personal narratives are just cut. And so like I mean, it could also be like a cheesy thing to put in your novel. Like you could say it's like, it's easy to separate. For example, it's much easier for people to have love matches, or like to run away, or for women to change their fortunes, like women who are in some kind of parda, or like just not allowed out very much, or suddenly like have to go get a job and that kind of thing. Um, so it can be like a plot device, too, I think. But yeah, it's a fascinating era that I think people still don't know enough about, and the history is suppressed, like in India and Pakistan. It's also suppressed in the UK because they don't want to know about the problem they caused. Like I found that out recently, that it's not taught like a lot in schools in the UK. People don't really know about the partition very much.
Yeah, you recently encountered how in UK they don't talk about the partition and the violence that comes with it. We wish you would have translated that novel, but I'm genuinely surprised. The first novel that you have picked up is like the 1,000 pages book. I did read Yashpal's Dada Comrade. I think that's also an extraordinary
Oh
novel
yeah. I love that novel, yeah.
that is grappling with the question of Naxalism that is
Hmm.
happening in India. I think the next thing I want to talk to you about is about Geetanjali Shree's Tomb of Sand. the novel that you have translated and that has won the International Booker Prize. So, how was your interaction with Geetanjali Shree? What kind of challenges you have faced in terms of interacting with Geetanjali Shree and finally agreeing on what words to use in the novel and how the novel should take its final form? And number two, the difficulty of translating a Hindi text into English, right? So, these are the two broad questions. One is about the translation of the text, and second thing is about your interaction with the author of the book while translating. So could you throw some reflections on this?
Well, I I never met her until we went to London for the International Booker shortlist
Really?
ceremony. Yeah, because it was COVID, you know. I had I had been thinking of going to India to like because it was so hard. Like these things are interconnected. It was so hard. That novel was so hard. That I started to think I can't do this unless I like sit down with her. But then I couldn't because of COVID. So we did everything via email. Like we never, we never Zoomed. We never sent voice notes. We never talked on the phone. We just emailed. Like, must be hundreds of emails. And so I would just like ask her tons and tons of questions. And which is hard, like to write it all out, like you have to give the context and then explain what it is you want to know, because otherwise the author is going to explain the wrong thing to you. So you say like very precisely what it is you need to know. Um, and so like write out the sentence in Hindi. So I just like it was minute kind of work, just on and on, and often like were many areas where we'd have to do it a few times, a few rounds of questions, and then eventually I sent her a draft, and then she went through the whole thing, and and would kind of go like crazy, like she would rewrite, an entire page or something. Like, and I don't think it was even that she thought it was all wrong. She just like would get on a roll. And so I'd have to do that like compare documents thing and figure out like what, if there was something in that whole page that I needed to know, like maybe something I got wrong, and then go back to my text and like stick in the little words. And then right around that time, my computer died, and like half the book, I had just gone through her edits and like redone my edits. Then I had to redo the entire thing again, and it was a absolute nightmare. Um, it was so hard to translate that book because there's a lot of ambiguity in her writing. So like you don't know who's doing what, and you can do that in Hindi too. Like that's a quality of Hindi that you don't have to put the subject, or even the object into a sentence. And and so even if I want to reproduce the ambiguity, I have to kind of understand what's under the ambiguity, what's the subtext, because um like it has to be ambiguity that signals what's going on in some way. So that is very difficult. And then she makes up words, or she uses very obscure words. So there's lots of things that aren't in the dictionary. She uses grammar unconventionally and has like lots of broken sentences and things like that. And then of course there's the word play where she'll do something like use an idiom that if it was by itself, I might just translate it straight or like use different kind of idiom in English or something. But she'll use an idiom and then she'll keep using some of the words that were in the idiom. So I have to figure out a way to use it. Like, this isn't a real example. This is like a hypothetical example. But say she said like, Jiski lati uski bhans or something like that. So then she would keep talking about lattes and masses, so I couldn't say like might makes right or, something like that. I'd have to somehow translate the idiom literally so that I could keep bringing the masses into the sentences. So that's very difficult. And and she's also, I'm opinionated and she's opinionated and she knows English well, and her English is not the same as my English. We disagreed on various points, and we like somehow managed to kind of get through it. But one, notable example is that she never liked the title. Um, and we'll still, like, if people invite us to speak together, we'll still argue about it on stage if somebody brings it up. And, sometimes the moderators look a bit uncomfortable because we'll start arguing about it.
That's a very interesting story. I think one thing I want to talk about is, which is right now talked about everywhere, is AI. Right now, AI translation tools are like improving rapidly, and there's this great anxiety, I suppose, in the literary world itself, because now books being withdrawn because they have been used. The authors used AI. There are such allegations. So what do you think the AI can and cannot do when it comes to translations? And is the anxiety real for the translators?
Well, I'm like one of those 100% anti-AI people. Um, but both because it's like basically plagiarizing, it's a plagiarism machine, but also because of the environmental costs that these data centers cause. But for literary translation, it would never be an adequate substitute because what we're translating is not just the words on the page, and AI doesn't know what that other stuff is, like the culture and history and resonance and um vibes and whatever you want to call it. Like the AI can't ever know those things because literature is not just a bunch of words on the page. It's, like each word, each phrase, each paragraph, they have fields of meaning that are invisible around them. And they can't just be sort of hammered out by use of AI. And then, of course, AI also makes mistakes. And I've read that, there was a study that showed that AI will always be wrong 30% of the time, no matter what. Like, no matter how much it's improved, it is built into the model that it can't not make mistakes or hallucinate. And that's the problem, is that a lot of, I wouldn't say so much like literary publishers, but other publishers and other parts of industries that use translation, like that need translation, they'll run something through AI and then they'll hire a translator for less than what they would have hired them for to translate it from the beginning, and tell them to fix it. And it's actually harder to fix an AI translation than to start from scratch, because you have to go through it word for word and try to figure out what the errors are. And it's AI translations have this air of plausible validity, or like, because they're smooth. So like if a person translates something badly, you can often tell right away, even if you don't know the language. You can say like there is something wrong here. Um, but with an AI translation, it's always smooth, and you don't have that initial impression, like, oh, this is garbage, right? And it's only when you sort of dig in that you start to realize what it's doing wrong, because it can't, despite what the tech bros tell us, it can't feel, it's not sentient, it doesn't understand, it's just but like eaten up all these texts and is sort of reforming them. So that is my view on that subject.
No, that is very interesting. Now, I want to talk a little bit about your readers, which is, I think you have taken Hindi and Urdu literature to South Asian diaspora specifically, right? Who would love, I mean, you just mentioned that after 10, nobody will read
Yeah.
Hindi books at all. So you have taken the language there. So tell us something about these readers. I mean, what do you wish that your English readers understood about Hindi and Urdu literature, which they currently don't? One thing you have clearly mentioned, which is that if you want to read Yashpal, you can actually go directly read him and not read the translation. If you know Hindi,
Yeah,
you don't
go
have to
for
worry
it.
about it. So what else are your reflections about your reader? What do you expect the readers to understand that they currently don't have a flavor of?
Well, I when I first started translating, I mistakenly thought that my readers would be people that were totally knew nothing about India or South Asia. And I started to realize over time that I was wrong. Um, and like I get tagged a lot on Bookstagram reviews for my translations. And it's funny because people even tag me if they say unflattering things about the translation. But anyway, I started to realize that a lot of my readers actually can read Hindi and Urdu, but don't. And I think a part of it is it's that class 10 thing, so that they don't they feel nervous. They feel like they can't do it. And so sometimes I think days of like they of somebody will say, this translation is okay, but I feel like it's it's like there's something lost and it's getting in the way of me appreciating this book. Um, and I started to realize that what was lost was the reader because they were not in touch with their own language, right? So they don't have to be reading my translation, but they think they have to be because they feel so disconnected from this language that they actually know. Um, but they're scared. And so, like, at first I was annoyed at them, like, why are you picking on me for translating this when you could just go and read it? If you think it's lost in translation, go read it yourself, right? But and I realized they didn't think they could. And so one thing that changed with the way I translate is for one thing, to sort of invite that readership in because that is actually like the majority of the readership that I have. Either that or they know Hindi but not Urdu or vice versa. So they can't read it, but they know the language, and that can feel frustrating, I think, to know that you have to read it in English. Whereas if like somebody read it aloud to you, you might understand it. But again, I would say like go learn the script. It's not so bad, right? Anyway, I started to like add aspects to my translation that were more welcoming to that readership. But I also usually say in my introductions like go read the book. Like I even say that in Tomb of Sand, use this book if you feel insecure about your vocabulary, whatever, use the English one to read the Hindi one, keep them both open at once. So I do feel like my role is partly a bridge, like, but not in the common way that translation is talked of as a bridge, like a bridge from point A to point B. And it's like, my readers are out here at point B, and let's try to invite them back to point A. Like, I don't want you to have to read my English translation if you don't want to. Don't go ahead and don't do it. Um, but then a funny thing is that the people who aren't insecure, the people who do read in Hindi and Urdu, also read my translations. And like sometimes they say funny things. Like I think it's funny. They'll say like, "Oh well, I always like your translations better than the original works." And I say, well, that's not fair. These are good books, but I think it's and you have to remember that like a translator wrote every word in that translation you're reading, every single word. So it's just an illusion that you're reading the original text. You're not. You're reading something in a different language, written by a different person, who is just like, we're like conjuring that text, but it's an illusion. So, so it's possible to really like a certain translator's style because you like the way they write, because they wrote all those books that they translated. So that I do think that it's fine in that sense that you become, partial to a particular translator, because not just because they can get the words right, because again, um that's the most basic thing in translation. That's the thing that AI can do, is say this word equals that word. It's not just about getting the words right, but that's how a lot of people evaluate translation. They say, well, this translation is bad because on page 57, the translator got this word wrong. This one word right here. But I don't think that that's how people should evaluate translations. I mean, obviously, if somebody really botched it, like really just on a global level misunderstood what a book was about or something like that. And of course, you get into something like translating the Gita, or, like some religious text where, the meaning is like something that you have to think about in a very fine-tuned manner because it's been rehashed so much, and it's also spiritual, so that kind of thing. So there's you could say this translation of the Gita is wrong because the translator misunderstands the concept of dharma or something like that. But most of the time with a novel, it's not going to be like that. But I do think it's valid to say this is a bad translation because it's not well written, right? Like a good translation should be well written, unless, of course, the source text was badly written. But then why did you translate a whole book that was badly written?
Those were very interesting observations that you have just made, Daisy. What are you translating now?
Well, I am translating this. There's this Urdu author named Hijab Imtiaz Ali, and she was known as the Queen of Romance, and she also wrote horror stories. So it's sort of genre fiction. She wrote, mostly like from the 30s through the 80s or something. She had a long career. Um, but one thing that I think she's very funny, and all her books and her stories and everything have basically the same characters, or like a revolving cast of characters. The narrator is always the same person. Um, and then there's certain other characters that just constantly show up. And it's not like a world building thing where it's like, oh no, we can't have that happen to him because he died in the last story or something. She'll have people die all the time and then like come back in the next story. It's like it's a clean slate and everybody can start afresh. And they're very these characters live in this sort of elegant world, like these Havelis and stuff like that, but it's sort of like pre-independence Hyderabad slash like Iran, Iraq, like in the 20s or something like that. So it is like a world building thing in that sense that she has these made up place names and weird details that often are kind of funny. Like I was just translating something yesterday where she said like, well, I was so upset. I took my quilt stuffed with sea parrot feathers out to the rose garden and lay down for a nap. And so then I have to spend a certain amount of time figuring out if like a Dariai Tota, like is there such a thing as a sea parrot? Or does she mean a seagull, maybe? Or so I have all these friends that I irritate all the time. I'm constantly sending WhatsApp messages with like little bits of text saying, "Do you think she means seagull?" You know, and like this one person tried to convince me that the quilt wasn't stuffed with the feathers, it was covered with a pattern, like a design of parrot feathers, because it was, barahua, right? So he said, couldn't it be like barahua, like filled in, like as with a drawing? But then someone else said, no, this is definitely the feathers. Barahua can only mean that the feathers were stuffed inside the quilt. And someone else said, well, it can't be true because I don't think that parrots could shed enough feathers to stuff a quilt. The thing is that she just does very absurd things that have no basis in reality. So I'm translating a group of horror short stories and novellas. Um, right now I'm on the last novella that I'm going to translate, where they're going on this expedition to a remote jungle um, on an island, I think, and they're going to go investigate this place called the Gateway of Death. And every time an adventurer goes into the Gateway of Death, they never come out again, obviously. So they go, she and her friends go and set up their tents, which sound very fancy, like they have beds and they have all their servants and they have these elaborate meals. And then they sit around talking about the gateway of death and what, and so it's like it's horror, but it's very, very funny.
Looking forward to that. Daisy, thank you so much for your time today. It was a lovely conversation. There's a lot of laughter in our conversation today. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you.